The night the Yasani Compact declared humanity extinct, 10 million voices sang the victory hymn across the Vale anchorage, and not one of them heard the void answer back. Keeper Oman Sharel stood on the high terrace of the festival ring and watched the lights go up. He was old, even by the long reckoning of the compact, and he had keeping festivals for 240 years. He had recorded the burning of the ledger. He had recorded the closing of the third wound. He had stood on this same terrace and counted the warships home from 9 campaigns. But he had never seen a gathering like the one spread out below him now, and he knew, the way an old keeper knows things, that he would never see one again. The Vale anchorage was the oldest mustering point in the compact, a station the size of a small moon hung at the edge of the tanning verge, where 40 species had pooled their fleets for 9,000 years. Tonight it held more ships than it had ever held. 800,000 warships floated in their tiers, lit from prow to stern, their running lamps turned all the way up so that the anchorage itself seemed to burn. Between them moved the festival barges, slow and gold, carrying singers and brewers, and the long banners of every fleet that had answered the call. The hymn rolled out of them in waves, one tier picking it up as the last let it fall, so that the song never stopped and never began. It simply was, the way a tide is. Oman Sharel had been asked to keep this festival because it was the most important festival the compact would ever hold. The reason was written on the great board above the terrace, in the high letters that only keepers were taught to read. The board said that humanity was dead. It had taken the compact 11 years and the largest war fleet ever assembled to make those words true. 11 years of pushing inward toward the small blue world at the end of the Orion Shelf, the world that had refused every summons, refused every law, refused even to be afraid. The humans had been a problem for longer than that. They had appeared at the edges of charted space some 4 centuries before, a single species in a handful of fragile ships, and they had not bowed. They had not joined. They had not asked permission. They had simply spread, quietly and stubbornly, until the compact understood that there was now a thing in the galaxy that did not recognize the galaxy's order. So the compact had done what the compact did. It had gathered. It had built. It had sent the reaping fleet inward, 400,000 hulls under the biomarshals of the Yasani, and it had done to the human worlds what the Yasani knew how to do better than any other species alive. The Yasani did not fight with guns alone. The Yasani grew their wars. Their weapon was a thing they called the bloom, a living tide that they seeded into a world's water and air and soil, a horror that took root in stone and bone alike and turned a living planet into a single spreading organism that answered only to them. It had never failed. In 9,000 years it had unmade 311 worlds that had said no to the compact, and every one of those worlds was now a quiet garden of Yasani flesh, singing in the dark. Earth had taken longer than the others. That was the only thing anyone could say against it. The bloom had needed 4 years to fully take the human homeworld, 4 years where the readings came back wrong, and the marshals lost seeding ships faster than they could account for. But it had taken. The marshals had confirmed it. The blue world was gray now, wrapped in the slow gray lung of the bloom, and the readings said no human heartbeat remained anywhere in the system. 11 years, 400,000 hulls, 312 dead worlds now, instead of 311. And so the song. Oman Sharel turned his recording stylus over in his long fingers and watched the barges drift. He should have been glad. The whole anchorage was glad. 800,000 crews and the festival fleets, and the biomarshals themselves in their black tower at the center of it all. The galaxy was whole again. The thing that did not bow had been made to lie down. It was the keeper's work to write the gladness down so that the children of the compact would have it forever, and he meant to do that work well. But he had kept too many festivals. He had learned, over 240 years, to feel the shape of a true ending. A true ending had a particular quiet underneath it, a settling, the way a building settles when the last stone is finally set. He had felt it at the closing of the third wound. He had felt it at the burning of the ledger. It was the feeling of a thing that was actually over. He did not feel it now. He felt the song, and the lights, and the warmth of 10 million voices. But underneath them, where the settling should have been, there was nothing. Not a wrongness, just an absence. A place where the quiet of a true ending should have lived, and did not. He had noticed it 3 days ago, and told no one, Because what was there to tell? The board said the war was won. The marshals said the readings were clean. A keeper's old feeling was not evidence. He looked down at the song one more time, and he wrote in his record the first words of the festival, the words he was supposed to write. On the night the compact's longest war ended, the anchorage sang. Then he stopped, and he looked at the words, and a cold thing moved in his chest that he could not name. Because the words were true, and he had written them, and still the quiet of a true ending did not come. Far below, on the festival barge nearest the terrace, a young Yasani brewer named Sef Haloon was filling the long cups for the marshal's table. She was 19, which was barely anything, and she had never been off her homeworld until this campaign, and she did not have a keeper's old feeling about endings. She had only the ordinary feelings of the young. She thought the lights were beautiful. She thought the song was too long. She thought the marshals in their black tower looked very far away, and very cold, and she was glad she would never have to speak to one. Oman Shirel watched her without knowing her name. He noticed her because noticing was his trade. He had spent 240 years learning to see the small true things inside a large official one, the brewer who did not believe the toast, the child who cried at the wrong moment, the officer who saluted the marshals a beat too late. The official thing tonight was the death of humanity. The small true thing, the keeper thought, was that nobody on the festival fleet actually understood what had been killed. They had been told it was a problem, a stubbornness, a thing at the edge of the dark that had refused the galaxy's order. They had not been told who the humans were, because the compact did not record who its enemies were, only that they had said no, and saying no was all a compact citizen needed to know. That was the part that had begun to trouble the keeper 3 days ago, the part underneath the missing quiet. He had pulled the war record to write the festival opening, the way a keeper does, so that the song would have the proper weight of history behind it. And he had found that the war record was strange. It was thin, where it should have been thick. 11 years of campaign, 400,000 hulls, and almost nothing about the enemy. There were tactical entries, fleet movements, seeding reports, but there was no entry that answered the simplest keeper's question, the question a keeper asks of every war, so the festival will be true. Who were they? It was a strange question to feel the lack of, on a night built to celebrate their ending. A keeper was supposed to know the enemy at the end of a war better than at the start, because that was when the record was finally complete, when every battle was fought and every account was filed, and the whole shape of the thing could be seen at last. But Oman Shirel knew less about the humans now than the compact had known 4 centuries ago, when they had first appeared at the edge of the dark. 4 centuries ago, the record had at least admitted there was a mystery. Now the record was certain, and the certainty had eaten the mystery and left nothing in its place, no understanding, no portrait, no answer, only the flat word stubborn and the flat word dead. A keeper who has spent 240 years among records learns that certainty without understanding is the most dangerous thing a record can hold, because it is the shape a lie takes when it wants to look like a fact. The record did not say. It said they did not bow. It said they spread. It said the bloom had taken 4 years to root in their homeworld instead of the usual season, and that the marshals had filed this as evidence of human stubbornness. But it did not say what the humans had been doing during those 4 years. It did not say why the seeding ships had been lost faster than the Yasani could account for. It did not say where the lost ships had gone, or whether they had been destroyed, or whether they had simply stopped reporting. The record had a hole in it the size of a war, and the marshals had filled the hole with the word stubborn and moved on to the festival. A keeper learns to be afraid of holes in records. A hole is where the true thing hides. Oman Shirel had stared at that hole for 3 days, and the missing quiet underneath the festival had grown louder the longer he stared, until tonight, standing on the terrace above 10 million singers, he had stopped trying to name it and simply written what he saw, which was light and song, and a board that said humanity was dead, and no settling underneath any of it. He looked once more at the young brewer with her 9 cups, and he thought, without quite knowing why, that he hoped she would be all right. Then the song faltered. It did not stop. 10 million voices do not stop all at once. But somewhere out near the dark tiers, near the edge where the lamps thinned into the open void, a section of the hymn went ragged, the way a flame goes ragged in a draft. Sef Haloon looked up from her cups, so did 1,000 others. So, on the high terrace, did the keeper. Out past the last lit tier, in the place where the anchorage's light gave way to the tanning verge, and the long dark beyond it, something had changed. Not a light. The opposite of a light. A patch of the void had gone darker than void. A deep absence shaped like a wound. And as the keeper watched, frozen, his stylus still pressed to the record, the absence began to widen. The song near that edge died completely. And from the wound in the dark, slow and enormous and without a single running lamp, the first prow came through. It came through the way a continent would come through a curtain. The first prow was gray, not the polished gray of a festival hull, not the black of the marshal's tower, but a flat, dead, gunmetal gray that drank the anchorage light and gave nothing back. It had no lamps, it had no banners. It had no markings that any species at the anchorage could read, only long lines of something stenciled along the flank in a sharp angular hand, and a number, and a name. The keeper, who could read more scripts than anyone alive, leaned over the terrace rail and read the name through the long glass, and his breath stopped. The name was in the human tongue. He had learned a little of it during the war, the way a keeper learns the tongue of the enemy so the record will be true. He read it twice to be sure. The name on the prow was Grave of the Patient. It came on without slowing. It was not a small ship. The Vale anchorage measured its warships in tiers, and a heavy compact dreadnought stood 300 strides from keel to spine, and the festival had gathered them in their thousands, and thought itself the mightiest thing the galaxy had ever assembled. The gray prow coming through the dark was 1,100 strides from keel to spine, and it was not the largest of the shapes coming through behind it. Because there was more than one. The wound in the void widened, and a second prow came through beside the first, and a third behind those. And then the keeper lost count, because they did not come through one at a time. They came through in a line, and then the line was a wall, and then the wall was a tide. Gray hull after gray hull, sliding out of the dark with no lamps and no song, each one larger than anything the anchorage held, each one named in the sharp human hand. The keeper read the names as they passed, because reading was the only thing his hands knew how to do. Long memory, the cost, witness, salt and iron, 96 winters, we were told. He stopped reading the names after the 40th, because his stylus had begun to shake. There was a thing the keeper noticed that the marshal's instruments could not, because it was not a thing an instrument measures. He noticed how the gray ships moved. A compact fleet moved like a fleet, ships jockeying for their places, lamps signaling, the small constant fidget of 800,000 crews each flying their own hull. The gray fleet did not fidget. It moved like one thing. 800 dreadnoughts, each larger than anything the compact had ever launched, held a formation so perfect that the keeper could find no flaw in it through the long glass. No drift, no correction, no hull astride out of place. They moved the way a single hand moves its fingers, together, without the fingers needing to be told. The keeper had kept the records of 9 campaigns, and he had never seen a fleet fly like that. And the perfection of it frightened him more than the size, because the size was only a matter of building, and a galaxy could in principle build large. The perfection was a matter of will, of a fleet that had become, somehow, one mind across 800 hulls. And the keeper understood that he was not looking at a navy. He was looking at a decision, made by a whole species, given the shape of 800 ships, and sent across the void to be carried out. On the festival barge, Sef Haloon had set down her cups. The song was dying all across the anchorage now, tier by tier, not because anyone had ordered silence, but because a voice cannot sing and stare at the same time. The light of the gathering caught the gray hulls and slid off them, and found nothing to hold to. They were so dark, those ships. They were the color of an old wound that had stopped bleeding a long time ago, and never quite healed. She did not know the human tongue. She did not need to. She understood, the way the young understand things in their bodies before their minds catch up, that these ships had come a very long way, and that they were not here for the festival. The keeper made himself keep counting. It was the only thing he knew how to do. And a keeper who stops counting at the worst moment is no keeper at all. He counted the prows as they came through the wound, and he wrote the count in the margin of the record, and the count climbed past 200, and past 300, and he understood that he was no longer counting a fleet, he was counting an arrival. There is a difference. A fleet has a number a keeper can hold in his mind. An arrival is the kind of thing that happens to a galaxy, the kind of thing keepers in other ages had written about, and that he had read as a young keeper, and thought he understood, and had not. Not until now. Not until he stood at a rail and watched the dark give up 4 centuries of patience all at once. He thought about the hole in the war record, the lost seeding ships, the 4 years it had taken the bloom to root. He thought about it, and the gray prows came through the dark with no lamps, and slowly the hole in the record began to fill itself in his mind, in a shape he did not want and could not stop seeing. The seeding ships had not been destroyed. They had been watched. The 4 years had not been stubbornness. They had been work. Every season the marshals had spent confirming the death of Earth. The humans had spent under their own dying surface, building the gray shapes coming through the wound, and the marshals had read the wrong readings and written the wrong word and held a festival for it, and the keeper had nearly written the festival opening that called it a clean and certain end. He looked at the words he had already written. On the night the Compact's longest war ended, the anchorage sang. He did not cross them out. A keeper does not cross out the truth, even when the truth turns out to be the smaller half of a larger one. But he drew, very carefully, a single line beneath them, the line a keeper draws when a thing he has written is about to be answered by a thing he has not yet seen, and he waited, with his stylus ready, for the answer. In the black tower at the center of the anchorage, the biomarshals were already moving. There were 9 of them, the high command of the reaping fleet, the ones who had grown the war and watered it for 11 years. They were ancient and certain, and they had never, in their long lives, been surprised by anything, because their weapon could not be surprised. The bloom did not fight battles. It did not meet fleets. It seeded a world and waited and won. The marshals had not stood at a fighting station in 9,000 years, and they did not understand at first what they were looking at. The eldest of them, a marshal called Veth Saran, who had personally seeded 40 of the 312 dead worlds, leaned toward the great lens and said, the only thing that made sense. Identify them. Those are not compact hulls. Whose fleet is that? The answer took longer than it should have. The anchorage held the finest sensor arrays of 40 species, 9,000 years of refinement, and they reached out toward the gray tide and came back confused. The ships read cold, not powered down, not hiding, simply cold, as if there were no living thing aboard any of them, and no fire in any of their cores. They read empty, and yet they moved, in perfect order, 800 of them now, and still pouring through the wound in the dark, each one holding its place in a formation so exact that the spaces between the hulls did not change by a single stride. They have no power signature, the sensor officer reported, and his voice climbed as he said it. Marshal, they have no crew signature. They read as derelicts. They read as wrecks. Wrecks do not fly in formation, said Veth Saran. No, Marshal. Then your instruments are wrong. Find me the truth of those ships. But the instruments were not wrong, and the keeper, far above on the terrace, was the first soul in the anchorage to understand why. He had spent his life learning the human tongue so the record would be true, and he had read more than the names on the prows. He had read the long stenciled lines down the flanks of the lead ship, the angular human script, and he had understood it, and the understanding had gone into him like cold water. The lines on the flank of the grave of the patient were a list. They were a list of worlds. He recognized the form because he had kept records his whole life, and a list of worlds in a keeper's hand looked the same in any tongue. There were 312 names on that flank, stenciled in neat rows, each one a world. He did not know all of them, but he knew some, because he had recorded the festivals that celebrated their fall, and the cold went deeper into him as he matched the human names to the compact names he knew. The third name in the second row was the human name for the world the compact called Sethionar, the first world the bloom had ever taken, 9,000 years ago. The last name in the last row, freshly stenciled, the paint barely cured, was the human name for Earth. These were not derelicts. These were not wrecks. These were the human dreadnoughts, and they had come out of the void to the place where the galaxy was singing about their deaths, and they had brought with them a list of every world the compact had ever murdered, and Earth's name was on the bottom because Earth had been the last. The keeper read the list down the flank twice, to be certain, because certainty was the whole of his trade, and because what he was seeing changed the size of everything. 312 worlds. He had not known the number until tonight. No one in the compact knew the number, because no one in the compact had ever written it down in one place. The deaths had happened across 9,000 years, scattered through the records of 40 fleets, each one filed as a separate victory in a separate festival, each one a song, each one forgotten the moment the next song began. No keeper had ever gathered them, no marshal had ever wanted them gathered. A number like 312 was the kind of number that, written down in one place, on the flank of one ship, stopped being a series of victories and became something else. Something that did not have a name in the compact tongue, something the human tongue apparently had a name for, because the humans had bothered to gather it. And they had carried it here. That was the part that went deepest into the keeper as he read. They had not just survived, they had not just built a fleet in the dark, they had spent some part of those 11 dying years doing what keepers do. They had gathered the dead. They had crossed every record of every fleet somehow, across 9,000 years, and they had pulled out the name of every world the bloom had ever taken, and they had painted those names down the flank of a warship in neat rows, in their own hand, so that the list could not be unfiled, could not be scattered, could not be turned back into a series of forgettable songs. They had made a keeper's record out of a fleet's memory, and then they had flown it to the festival. The keeper understood, with a feeling that was very close to shame, that the humans had done his job better than the compact had ever let him do it. The keeper's stylus moved before he told it to. It wrote 3 words in the record, the truest words he would write that night. They are mourning. He had kept too many festivals not to know the shape of a thing. The gray hulls without lamps, the absence of song, the list of the dead worn on the flank like a banner. This was not a war fleet arriving, not at first. This was a funeral procession, and it had come to the wake to read the names aloud. Down in the anchorage, the marshals were still demanding power readings. The human ships did not give them any. They came on, 800 now, 1,000, the formation tightening as the leaders cleared the wound and slid into the lit space of the anchorage, and they did the one thing that no warship in the compact's 9,000 years had ever done in the presence of the gathered fleet. They moved through the outer tiers without firing. They moved through them as if the compact warships were buoys, as if they were markers in a harbor, as if 800,000 of the mightiest hulls the galaxy could build were furniture. They did not shove them aside. They did not need to. They simply held their formation and let the compact ships scatter out of the path the way startled birds scatter from a slow large thing that does not even look at them. And as the lead ship passed the first tier of festival barges, it spoke. It did not speak in fire. It spoke on the open band, the broad festival frequency that carried the hymn, so that every soul at the anchorage heard it at once, in their own tongue, because the human ship had taken the trouble to translate itself for 40 species. The voice was not loud. It was the worst thing about it, how quiet it was. It was the voice of someone speaking at a graveside, who does not need to raise his voice because everyone has already stopped talking. "This is the grave of the patient," the voice said. "We have come for the names." Sef Haloon on her barge felt the words go through her chest. She did not understand them. She understood them completely. She had never in her short life heard a voice like that one. The voices of the compact were loud. Marshals were loud. The festival hymn was loud. Even the prayers her grandmother had taught her, the old Yasani prayers for a safe seeding and a good harvest of the dead, were loud, sung at the top of the lungs so the worlds being grown over would know they had been won. Loudness was how the compact said important. And here was the most important voice she had ever heard. The voice of a thing the size of a moon that had just made the galaxy stop singing. And it was quiet. It was the quiet of someone who did not need to convince you of anything, because they already knew they were right, and the knowing made her colder than any loud thing ever had. She looked at the cups she had filled, 9 of them, for the marshal's table, for the men in the Black Tower who had won the war. She had been proud, an hour ago, to fill the marshal's cups. It had seemed like the most important thing a brewer could do, to pour for the men who had ended the longest war in the history of the galaxy. Now she looked at the 9 full cups going cold on their tray, and she did not know what she had been proud of, and the not knowing was the first crack in a wall inside her that would take the rest of the night to come down. "You have a list," the voice went on, still quiet, still even. "We have the same list. You read it as a record of victories. We read it as a record of the dead. Tonight we are going to read it together, world by world. And when we reach the end of it, you are going to understand what you celebrated. Veth Serun, in the Black Tower, found his voice. He was a marshal of the Yasani, and he had grown the deaths of 312 worlds, and he was not afraid of a procession of cold ships with no power in their cores. He keyed the open band so that his answer would also reach every soul in the anchorage, because a marshal does not let an enemy have the last word at a festival. Humanity is dead, he said. We have the readings. Your homeworld is gray and singing in our garden. Whatever you are too late by 11 years and 1 world. There is nothing left of you to mourn. There was a silence on the band. The keeper, above, held his breath. Then the human voice answered, and for the first time it was not quiet. You took 11 years to reach our homeworld, it said. Did you never wonder why? The marshal did not answer. 311 worlds fell in 9,000 years, the voice said. Ours took 11 years and 1 season more, and you lost seeding ships the whole way in, and your readings came back wrong for 4 years, and you decided that meant we were stubborn. You wrote stubborn in your festival record. You should have written something else. A second wound was opening in the dark, far across the anchorage, on the opposite side from the first. The sensor officers saw it and began to shout. The marshals turned toward it, and the voice on the band, quiet again now, said the thing that the keeper would carry to the end of his long life. We let you take Earth, it said. We needed you all in one place. And the second wound opened, and the second fleet came through. The second fleet was not a procession. The first one had come slow, lampless, grieving, a funeral wall sliding through the dark with its list of the dead worn on its skin. The second one came fast. It came through the wound on the far side of the anchorage in a single hard surge, hundreds of gray hulls arriving already in their fighting order, already turned, already aligned on the 800,000 compact ships caught between the 2 fleets. And the keeper, who understood now what he was watching, felt the last of his old keeper's calm go out of him, because he understood the shape of this too. It was a closing. The humans had not arrived. They had sprung. The funeral wall on one side, the fighting wall on the other. And the gathered might of the compact in the middle, 800,000 warships that had come to a festival, that had turned their lamps all the way up to celebrate, that were so packed into the tiers of the anchorage that they could not have formed a battle line in under a day. The marshals had built the largest gathering in the history of the galaxy, and the humans had let them, and now the 2 gray walls were the jaws of a thing that had been 9,000 years in the closing. There was a younger marshal in the Black Tower, the youngest of the 9, a Yasani named Resh Volun, who had grown only 11 worlds in his long life, and had been brought to the high command to learn the others' certainty. He was the one who saw the trap most clearly, because he was the one with the least to defend. He looked at the 2 gray walls, and the 800,000 packed hulls between them, and he did a thing the elder marshals had not done in 9,000 years. He ran the numbers backward. How long, he asked himself, had the humans needed to plan this? Not the fleet, the trap. To know that the compact would gather here, at this anchorage, on this night, with this many ships. To know that the festival would pack the tiers so tight no battle line could form. To arrive at both wounds at once, from opposite sides, in a closing that fit the gathering like a lid fits a jar. The humans had not reacted to the festival. They had been told about it, somehow. Or they had guessed it. And they had built their whole arrival around a celebration that the compact had only decided to hold once Earth was confirmed dead. Which meant the humans had known they would be confirmed dead. Which meant they had let it happen. Which meant the gray world wrapped in the bloom was not a defeat the humans were avenging. It was bait the humans had set. Resh Volun understood, before any of the elders, that the compact had not won a war 11 years ago. The compact had taken a piece. And the player who had given up the piece was now reaching across the whole board to take everything. He opened his mouth to say it. He never got the chance, because Veth Sarun spoke first. Veth Sarun understood it a heartbeat after the keeper did, though never as clearly as the young one beside him. He was old and certain, and he had never lost. But he was not stupid, and he saw the jaws and he gave the only order a marshal could give. Seed them, he said, all of them, Every hull, now. This was the Yasani weapon, and it had never failed. The bloom did not need a battle line. It did not need range or aim or time. Every compact ship at the anchorage carried seeding pods in its belly, living spores grown in the Marshal's own gardens, and at the Marshal's word, 800,000 hulls opened their bellies at once and flung the bloom into the void in a single vast gray cloud. It was the largest seeding the Yasani had ever performed. It was enough living spore to take 40 worlds. It drifted out toward the gray human walls, a tide of patient death, and the Marshals watched it go with the calm of beings who had done this 312 times and won 312 times. The bloom reached the human ships, and nothing happened. The spores touched the gray hulls and found no water to root in, no air to breathe, no warm living thing to take hold of. They found cold metal, colder than the void, scoured and salted and built by a species that had spent 11 years dying slowly inside its own homeworld, while the bloom tried to take it, learning every hour what the bloom needed and how to be the one thing it could not have. The human ships were not cold by accident. They were cold the way a thing is cold that has decided to give the enemy nothing to live on. The spores drifted across the gray flanks and slid off and died in the void, and the great cloud thinned and broke and was gone. The voice came back on the open band. It was almost gentle. "We are the world that took 11 years, it said. Did you really think we came out here warm?" The keeper, above, finally understood the 4 years. He had read the hole in the war record 3 days ago, and it had troubled him, and now the hole filled itself in completely, and the shape of it was worse than anything he had imagined. The Marshals had spent 4 years trying to take Earth with the bloom, and the readings had come back wrong the whole time, and they had written stubborn. But the readings had not been wrong. The readings had been the humans learning. 4 years of the bloom crawling across the human surface. 4 years of the living tide reaching for water and air and warm growing things. And 4 years of the humans below the surface, measuring exactly what the bloom needed, and building ships that gave it none of it. The bloom had not failed to take Earth quickly, because Earth was stubborn. The bloom had been a 4-year lesson, taught by the Marshals to their enemy for free, in the one subject the Marshals had never imagined an enemy could learn. The humans had let the bloom teach them how to be unbloomable, and then they had built 800 ships out of the lesson. The keeper wrote it in the record, in 3 short lines, because his hand was shaking too hard for long ones, and the 3 lines were the most important thing he had ever written, and he knew it. The bloom taught them. They listened for 4 years. They built what it could not have. In the Black Tower, the Marshals were very still. The bloom had not failed in 9,000 years. The whole order of the compact rested on the bloom not failing. Veth Sarun looked at the empty void where his weapon had been, and for the first time in his long life, he did not know what to do, and the not knowing was a thing he had no name for. And the keeper, watching the tower through the long glass, saw the Marshal's certainty crack, and understood that he was watching the end of something 9,000 years old. The young Marshal, Resh Volun, watched the bloom die, and felt something he had not been trained to feel, which was relief. It frightened him more than anything else that night, that small, ugly traitor flicker of relief, because he understood what it meant. It meant that some part of him, some part he had buried under 11 seedings, and the certainty of his elders, had always known the bloom was a wrong thing, and had been waiting, his whole long life, for something in the dark to be strong enough to stop it. He had never let himself think it. The compact did not let its Marshals think it. But the thought had been there, under the certainty, the way the missing quiet had been under the Keeper's festival, and now the gray fleet had reached across the void and pulled it up into the light, and Resh Volun stood in the Black Tower among the men who had made him, and understood that he did not want the bloom to win. He did not say that either. There are things even a brave Marshal does not say in a Black Tower full of his elders. But he stopped trying to find the order that would save the fleet, and he began, very quietly, to think instead about how a Marshal who did not want the bloom to win might get himself off the tower before the gray fleet reached it. Then the human fleets began to read the names. The keeper had thought it was a figure of speech. It was not. The lead ship of the funeral wall, the grave of the patient, spoke the first name on the open band, the human name and then the compact name, so that every soul at the anchorage heard both. "Setha Anar," the voice said. The first world your bloom took, 9,000 years ago. We have the readings you filed. We have the festival record you kept. 11 million people. The compact wrote it as a victory. And the funeral wall fired. It was not what the keeper expected. He had braced for the gray light of human weapons, for the void to fill with fire. Instead, the grave of the patient reached out across the anchorage and touched a single compact ship, one ship out of 800,000, a heavy Yasani cedar in the third tier, and the cedar simply ceased. There was no explosion. There was a moment where the ship was there, lamps and banners and all, and then a moment where it was not, where there was only a clean dark space the exact size of the hull, and then the space closed, and the void was smooth, and the ship was gone, as if it had never been built. No debris, no fire, nothing for the other ships to mourn over. The human weapon did not destroy, it unmade. It took a thing out of the count of things that existed, and left the universe smooth where the thing had been. One ship, for one world. The keeper understood, and the cold went all the way to the bottom of him. The choosing was the part that broke him, when he understood it. The grave of the patient had not fired at the nearest ship, or the largest, or the one that threatened it most. It had reached past hundreds of hulls to touch one specific cedar in the third tier, and the keeper, who had read the manifests off the open band the same as the humans, understood why that ship, and no other. It was a Yasani cedar of the oldest line, a hull that traced its building back 9,000 years, to the very fleet that had taken Sethi Anar. The humans had not picked a ship at random to stand for the first dead world. They had found, in 800,000 hulls, the one ship that had actually been there, and they had unmade that one, so that the first name on the list would be answered not by a symbol, but by the very thing that had done it. They had researched the murder of a world that died 9,000 years before humanity could speak, and they had carried that research across the void, and they were using it now, in the dark, with 800,000 guns trained on them, to make sure the right ship answered for the right crime. The keeper had spent his life believing that nothing was truly remembered, that the record was only a holding place against forgetting, that the dead were dead, and the worlds were silent, and the songs would always win in the end. He looked at the smooth place where the oldest cedar had been, and he understood that he had been wrong about the most important thing a keeper can be wrong about. Some things are remembered so completely, and carried so far, and answered so exactly, that 9,000 years are no protection at all. The humans were not going to fight the compact. They were going to read the list. Velentor, the voice said. The second world, the second compact ship ceased to exist, somewhere in the fourth tier. One clean, dark absence the size of a hull. 8 million people. A victory. Hannock, the voice said. The third. Another ship gone. 2 million. A victory. The marshals tried to fight back. Of course they tried. 800,000 warships do not die quietly, even caught in a jaw, even with their living weapon dead in the void. The compact fleets opened fire across the anchorage, the real weapons now, the lances and the rail throwers and the long burning beams, a wall of light flung at the two gray fleets from every tier at once, enough fire to crack a moon. The keeper flinched from the brightness of it. The human ships did not flinch. The fire reached them and broke on them, the way the spores had broken on them, scattered off the gray hulls and the cold fields that wrapped them, and where a compact beam should have torn a wound in a gray flank, there was only a smear of light that faded and left the hull unmarked. The funeral wall did not even change formation, it kept reading. The fighting wall on the far side held the jaw closed, and let the compact spend its fire against ships that would not be touched, and the voice on the band did not so much as pause for the storm of light breaking against it. Orson, the voice said, 4 million, a victory. Another ship ceased to exist. The keeper noticed, in the third reading, that the human voice was not simply naming the worlds. It was correcting the record. Each time it spoke a name, it spoke the human name, and then the compact name, and then it added the thing the compact record had left out, the thing keepers were never given. It added the people, 11 million for Sethi Anar, 8 million for Velentor, 2 million for Hannock. The compact had never written those numbers. The keeper knew, because he had pulled the war record 3 days ago, and the war record did not have them. The compact recorded worlds taken, not lives ended. Because a world taken was a victory, and a life ended was a death, and the compact held festivals for victories, and kept no record at all of deaths. The humans were filling in the second number. Every name on the list came with the count the compact had refused to keep, and the keeper realized that the humans had not only gathered the worlds across 9,000 years of scattered records, they had counted the dead of each one. They had done, for 312 murdered worlds, the work the murderers had never been willing to do. He wrote down the counts as the voice spoke them. He had to. He was the keeper, and these were the truest numbers anyone had ever spoken into the compact dark, and if he did not write them, then they would scatter again the moment the night was over, the way they had scattered for 9,000 years. So he wrote, world by world, the human name, and the compact name, and the count of the dead, and his record became the first honest ledger of the bloom that had ever existed, and it was being dictated to him by a fleet of warships that had crossed the void to read it aloud. Sef Haloon, on her barge in the middle of it all, watched a compact dreadnought 3 tiers over flicker out of existence between one breath and the next, and she did the thing the young do when the world ends, which is not scream. She went very quiet and very small, and she watched, and she understood that she was inside the list now, that her barge and her cups and her too long song were all somewhere on a flank, stenciled in a sharp human hand, and that the voice on the band was reading toward her, world by world, one ship for each dead world, and that there were 312 worlds on the list, and only the worlds mattered, not her, not the marshals, not the 800,000. The humans were not counting ships, they were counting worlds, and there were 312 of those, and the funeral wall had only reached the 4th. Above her, on the high terrace, the keeper finally moved. He had been frozen at the rail for a long time, watching, recording, his stylus filling the festival record with the truest and most terrible festival a keeper had ever kept. But he was a keeper of the compact, and there was a thing that keepers could do that no one else could, an old and almost forgotten right, and he understood now that he was the only soul in the anchorage who could use it. A keeper could speak on the festival band, not as a marshal, not as a commander, but as the voice of the record itself, the one voice the compact had agreed, 9,000 years ago, that all fleets must let speak. It was a ceremonial thing. It had not been used in anger in 1,000 years. But it was still law, and the human ships had spoken on the festival band, which meant they were listening on it, and the keeper realized that he, Oman Shirel, 240 years a keeper of festivals, might be the only being present who could say a thing to the Grey Fleet that the Grey Fleet would actually hear. He did not know if it would matter. He had heard the voice read 4 names and unmake 4 ships, and he did not think anything would stop the reading of the list. But he was a keeper, and a keeper's whole life was the belief that what is said matters, that the record matters, that a thing spoken into the dark does not simply vanish. He keyed the festival band with his old keeper's authority, and across the whole burning, dying anchorage, the human voice paused in its reading for the first time, because a new voice had spoken on the one band all fleets must heed. This is Oman Shirel, the keeper said, and his voice did not shake, which surprised him. Keeper of the Veil Festival, I am the one who was writing this down. The void was silent, 800,000 compact ships, and 800 gray human dreadnoughts, and 10 million silenced singers, all of them, for one moment, listening to an old man at a rail. I have a question for you, the keeper said. Not for the marshals, for you, the ones reading the list. Will you answer a keeper? And after a long, long pause, the human voice came back, quiet again, and it said, Ask. The keeper held the rail with both hands, and chose his words the way he had chosen words his whole life, slowly, because they were going into the record, and the record was forever. You said you came for the names, he said. You have read 4. There are 312, one ship for each world. When you reach the bottom of the list, when you have unmade 312 of these ships, will you stop? The pause was long. The anchorage held its breath inside it. No, said the human voice. The keeper closed his eyes. He had known, but he had hoped, and the hope had been worth speaking even to lose it. There are 800,000 ships here, the voice went on, quiet and even. 312 of them will go for the worlds. The rest will go because they are the fleet that grew the bloom, and the bloom does not get to keep existing. We did not come to balance a ledger, Keeper. We came to end a thing. There is a difference, and you of all people should know it. I do know it, the Keeper said. I have kept the record of that thing for 240 years. I kept the festival for Sethi Anar. I did not know what I was keeping, none of us did. We were told they were victories. He opened his eyes and looked out at the gray wall, and spoke the thing he had not let himself think until now. I think I have spent my whole life writing down murders and calling them songs. There was a silence on the band that was different from the others. The Keeper had spent 240 years learning the shape of silences, and he knew this one. It was the silence of someone who had not expected the truth and had received it anyway. Then you understand us better than your marshals do, the voice said. Why have you keyed the band, Keeper? You cannot stop the list. You cannot save these ships. You have said yourself what they are. I have not keyed the band to save the ships, the Keeper said. He turned, on his terrace, and he looked down at the festival barges, at the gold barges full of singers and brewers, and children who had come to sing a victory hymn, because that was what they had been told the night was for. He looked at the barge nearest the terrace, where a young brewer stood among her abandoned cups, looking up at him, and he did not know her name, but he knew her, because she was every soul who had come to the festival without growing a single death. There are 10 million people on the festival fleets, the Keeper said. Singers, brewers, keepers, children. They did not grow your worlds, human. They came to a party. They came because their marshals told them the war was won, and the night was for joy. They are inside your jaw, the same as the warships, and your list does not know the difference between a cedar and a barge full of children singing a song they were ordered to sing. He gripped the rail. I am not asking you to spare the fleet. I am asking you to see the barges. That is all. I am asking the funeral procession to do the one thing a funeral procession is supposed to do, which is to know the difference between the guilty and the grieving. The void was very quiet. Down on her barge, Sef Haloon realized that the old Keeper on the terrace was speaking for her, that the strange grave voice from the dark and the strange grave old man at the rail were having the only conversation in the whole burning anchorage that had her in it, and she found that she had begun to cry, not from fear, but from the simple, unbearable fact of being seen by someone, anyone, on the night the galaxy ended. The human voice, when it came back, had changed, not softened exactly, but it had stopped being the voice of the funeral and become the voice of a person, one person, somewhere inside the cold gray hull, and the Keeper understood that he had been speaking to a crew this whole time, to people, to the survivors of a world that had spent 11 years dying. We have already seen the barges, Keeper, the voice said. The Keeper went still. We have been here longer than you think, the voice said. We arrived at this anchorage before your festival did. We have watched 10 million people come aboard the gold barges for 9 days. We have read the manifests off your own open band. We know which hulls carry seeding pods and which carry brewers. We know which tier is warships and which tier is children. We have known since before the first prow came through the void, and every shot we have fired, and every shot we will fire, was chosen before we arrived. A pause. You think we are the bloom keeper? You think we are a tide that cannot tell a cedar from a singer? We are not the bloom. That is the entire difference between us. That is the thing your 312 worlds died to teach the galaxy, and the galaxy refused to learn. And then, on the open band, the human voice did a thing that made the Keeper sit down hard on the cold stone of the terrace, because his legs would not hold him. It began to read manifests. Not the list of worlds. The list of barges, the festival fleet, by name, every gold barge in the gathering, and beside each name, a word. The Keeper listened, and slowly he understood what the word was. It was a direction. The human fleet was not asking the barges to flee. It was telling them where the open lanes were, the gaps in the closing jaw, the cold corridors through the 2 gray walls, where no shot would be fired because the humans had built the corridors on purpose, had left them open on purpose, had planned a battle of 800,000 ships around the survival of 10 million people who had nothing to do with the war. Barge Hand 6, your lane is open to spinward. Hold your course and you will pass us untouched. Barge Solon, come about. Your current heading takes you into the warship tier. Your open lane is anti-spinward. We are holding it for you. Barge of the Brewers Guild. You are carrying 400 children. Your lane is the widest. It is the third from your prow. Go now. We will keep it open as long as you need. The keeper listened to the human voice name the barges, and he understood the scale of what it meant. 10 million people on the festival fleet. Thousands of barges. To leave a lane open for each one, in the middle of a battle of 800,000 ships, the humans had to have mapped the whole gathering before it gathered. They had to have known, 9 days ago, which barge would carry the brewers and which would carry the children, where each one would dock, and how each one would move when the song stopped and the panic started. They had built a battle plan that was mostly a rescue plan. The killing of the Marshal's fleet was almost the smaller part of it. The larger part, the part that must have taken months, the part no one would ever put on a banner, was the careful holding open of 10 million doors. The keeper had kept the records of 9 campaigns. He had never seen a fleet do this. Compact fleets did not leave lanes open. Compact fleets did not map the survival of the enemy's civilians. The whole idea was foreign to the way the Compact made war, which was the Bloom's way, the way of the tide that takes everything and sorts nothing. The humans were fighting in a way the Compact had no word for, and the keeper, who knew more words than anyone alive, understood that he was going to have to invent one, because the record would need it, because 400 species were going to ask how humanity had fought, and the true answer was a thing the galaxy did not yet have language for. The closest word he could find was the word for what a keeper does. The humans were not making war. They were keeping a difference. They were holding, in the middle of the worst night in the history of the galaxy, the line between the guilty and the innocent, and they were holding it with 800 warships and a list of 312 names, and they were not letting a single child fall across that line if they could keep a door open instead. The keeper wept openly on his terrace and did not care who saw, because he understood, finally, the whole shape of it. The humans had not sprung a trap on 800,000 ships and 10 million people. They had sprung a trap on the Bloom, on the Marshals, on the guilty. And around that trap, with a care that must have taken months to plan, they had built 10 million doors, and they were standing in the dark holding every door open with their own cold hands, while they read the names of the dead worlds, so that the singers and the brewers and the children could walk out of the worst night in the history of the galaxy alive. This was not what the keeper had been taught humanity was. He had been taught they were stubborn animals at the edge of the dark, a thing that did not bow, a problem to be grown over and forgotten. He had kept the festival of their extinction. He had been so wrong that the wrongness was a kind of awe. Down on her barge, Sef Haloon heard her own guild, named on the open band, heard the human voice tell the Brewers Guild barge where the wide lane was, heard it say 400 children, as if the 400 children were the most important fact in the whole anchorage, and she stopped crying, because there was work to do. She left her cups. She ran for the barge's helm, and she found the old barge master frozen at the controls, and she did the thing the young can do that the old sometimes cannot, which is move when the world has ended. She took the helm. She turned the barge anti-spinward, into the wide third lane, toward the gap the humans were holding open, and she flew 400 children out through the jaw of the gray fleet, while the void burned with the Compact's useless fire on every side, and not one shot touched her, because a thing in the dark with a list of 312 dead worlds had decided that she would live. She did not fly it perfectly. She was 19, and she had never held a helm before that night, and the barge was large and slow and full of frightened children, and twice she nearly took it into a tier of dying warships before she found the lane the human voice had named. Both times, the voice on the band caught her. It said her barge's name, calm and even in the middle of everything, and it told her to come about, told her where the open dark was, told her the lane would stay open as long as she needed, and both times she found it, and held it, and flew on. She did not understand how the voice could be watching one badly flown brewer's barge out of thousands, while it unmade a fleet, and read a list and held 10 million doors. She would not understand it for years. But she felt it. She felt herself being watched, the way a frightened child is watched by someone who has decided the child will live, and she flew on the strength of that feeling when her own hands were shaking too hard to fly on anything else. When she finally cleared the last gray wall and came out into the safe dark, she looked back once, through the barge's stern port, at the burning anchorage falling away behind her. She saw the festival lights still up. She saw the gold barges streaming out in their thousands, through lanes held open by lampless gray hulls. She saw a compact dreadnought flicker out of existence, clean and silent, somewhere in the middle of it all, and she knew it was a world being read aloud, and she did not feel glad, and she did not feel sorry, because she was 19, and she did not yet have the room inside her for what she was feeling. She only knew that she was alive, and the 400 children behind her were alive, and the thing that had made them alive was the same thing her marshals had crossed 11 years and 400,000 hulls to kill. Behind her, the reading went on. Tessine Bright, the voice said, the 30th world. A compact warship ceased to exist. Sethalor the 31st. Another. The marshal's fleet was thinning now, the cedars going one by one, clean and silent, while the festival barges streamed out through the held-open lanes in their gold thousands, and the keeper watched both things happen at once, and understood that he was watching the difference between justice and the bloom drawn in the dark, in letters a galaxy could not unsee. In the Black Tower, the young Marshal Resh Volun made his choice. He had spent the whole reading thinking about how a marshal who did not want the bloom to win might get himself off the tower. Now, as the list climbed, and the cedars went one by one, and the elders stood frozen in their broken certainty, he understood that the question had never really been about saving himself. The Grey Fleet had said it would unmake the tower. He believed it. There would be no escaping that. But there was a small ship docked at the tower's spine, a courier the marshals kept for carrying word between fleets, and Resh Volun was the youngest and the least watched, and he understood that he could reach it. The question was what to do once he reached it. He could run, the way the warships would soon run, fleeing home to grow another fleet, and seed another world, and become, in 1,000 years, the elder in some other black tower, teaching certainty to some other young marshal. Or he could do the other thing, the thing the relief in his chest had been pointing at all night. He could carry the truth home instead of the lie. He went quietly. None of the elders looked at him. They were watching their fleet die. He reached the courier, and he sealed it, and he keyed it loose from the spine, and as he did, the human voice spoke to him directly, on the narrow band of the courier, the way it had spoken to the brewer's barge. The way it spoke, the keeper would later understand, to every soul that night who made a choice instead of a stand. "We see you, Marshal," the voice said. "We have read your record too. 11 worlds. You were going to be one of them, the men in that tower. We have been wondering all night which of you would leave." A pause. "Your lane is open spinward. We will not touch the courier. Carry it home. Resh Volun. Carry the true one. We did not come all this way to kill a species. We came to give the galaxy a chance to be different, and a marshal who leaves the tower is the first chance we have seen." Resh Volun flew spinward, into the open dark, and he wept the whole way, and he carried home, in the courier's record, the first true account of the bloom ever to leave the black tower of a bio-marshal, written by a marshal's own hand. He would spend the rest of his life being hated for it by some, and believed by more, and he would never grow another world, and he would never be certain of anything again, and he would count that the best thing that had ever happened to him. Behind him, in the Black Tower, Veth Saroon watched his fleet die around the escaping barges, and did not notice that one of the 9 seats beside him was empty. The last of his certainty went, and something worse took its place. Because he had grown 312 worlds and called them victories, and he had never once, in 9,000 years, considered that the things he had grown over might someday be read aloud. He had thought the worlds were silent. He had thought silence was the same as forgotten. He had thought the festival meant it was over. And the cold gray voice in the dark read another name, and another, reading its way up the long flank of the grave of the patient, toward the bottom of the list, toward the last name, the freshest paint, toward Earth. It took the human fleet 4 hours to read the list. 4 hours is a long time to watch the most powerful order in the galaxy come apart. The Keeper had thought, in the first hour, that it would be quick, that a weapon which could unmake a hull without fire would simply sweep the anchorage clean in minutes. But the humans did not hurry. They could not, and the Keeper came to understand that the slowness was the point. There were 312 worlds on the list, and each one was read aloud in full, the human name and the compact name and the count of the dead, and the keeper understood, somewhere in the second hour, that a thing read too quickly is a thing not really mourned. The humans had waited 4 centuries and built 800 ships and crossed the void, and they were not going to rush the one part that mattered, which was the saying of the names. They gave each dead world its full moment. They made 800,000 ships, and 10 million people sit in the dark and listen to every single one. The slowness was not weakness. The slowness was the whole funeral, and a galaxy that had spent 9,000 years forgetting these worlds in the space of a single festival song was made, that night, to remember all 312 of them at the speed a thing must move to actually be remembered. The keeper kept the record for all of it. He did not look away once. He had decided, somewhere in the second hour, that this was the only festival he had ever kept that was true, and that the record of it had to be perfect, because it was the first honest thing the compact would ever have about the worlds it had grown over, and because the 10 million who flew out through the held open lanes deserved a keeper who had watched the whole thing with open eyes. The barges escaped, all of them. The keeper would learn that later, would confirm it himself in the days after, but he believed it as he watched, because the humans did exactly what they said they would do, every time, with a steadiness that was its own kind of terror. They held every lane, they never closed one early. When a barge took too long, frightened and slow and badly flown, the gray fleet simply kept the corridor open and let the compact's own fire spend itself uselessly against the cold hulls until the barge was clear. 10 million people who had come to sing about the death of humanity were escorted out of the trap by humanity, one barge at a time, while the fleet that had murdered 312 worlds came apart around them. And the marshal's ships went, name by name, world by world. The keeper noticed the pattern late, because it was a terrible pattern to notice. The humans were not killing 800,000 ships. They had said they would, in the first hour, when the funeral voice was cold. But as the reading went on, as the list unwound and the barges fled, and the keeper kept speaking quietly on the band, naming the lanes, helping the slow barges find the open dark, the human fleet had begun to change what it was doing. It unmade the cedars. It unmade the great bloom tenders, the gardens in hulls where the living weapon was grown. It unmade the Marshal's Tower last of all, the black tower at the heart of the anchorage, the 9 ancient beings who had grown the deaths of 312 worlds, and called every one a song. Those, it unmade. But the ordinary warships, the crews who had carried seeding pods because they were ordered to, and never grown a thing in their lives, the young officers and the pressed conscripts, and the 40 species who had been told this was a war and not a murder. Those, in the end, the humans let run. As the list neared its bottom, the gray fleet opened the jaw, not for the marshals, for the rest. The same held open lanes that had carried the barges out began to carry warships out too, the ones that turned and fled instead of firing, and the human voice said a thing on the band, once, that the keeper wrote down in letters he would never let anyone change. "We are not here to kill a species," the voice said. "We are here to kill a thing your species was using. There is a difference, and we are the only ones in this dark who have ever paid for knowing it. Run, if you are only a soldier. Stay, if you are the bloom. We will know which you are, we always have." The keeper watched the warships make their choice, and the choice was the most human thing he saw all night, though it was the compact's crews who made it. The lanes opened, the gray fleet stopped firing on anything that turned to run. And for a moment, a long, terrible moment, almost no one ran, because the crews of the compact had been raised for 9,000 years to believe that the dark was full of things that took everything and sorted nothing, and they could not believe that a thing in the dark would actually let them go. They held their stations, firing their useless fire, certain that the open lanes were a trick, certain that to turn and run was to be unmade from behind, because that was what the bloom would have done, that was what they would have done, that was the only kind of war they knew. The human voice spoke once into that hesitation. It did not order, it did not threaten, it simply said the truest thing it could, the thing that finally broke 9,000 years of certainty. "The lane behind you is real," it said. "We do not shoot the ones who turn. We never have. Go home and tell them why." And the first warship turned. One ship, somewhere in the 7th tier, A heavy hull that had been firing its lances against the gray wall for an hour, and getting nothing for it, turned and ran for the open dark, and was not fired upon. And then a second turned. And then the dam broke, and the whole gathered might of the compact came apart all at once, hundreds of thousands of hulls breaking station and pouring out through the lanes the humans held open, and not one of them was touched, and the keeper understood that he was watching 9,000 years of fear die in the space of a few minutes, replaced by something the compact had never had a word for, which was the simple, unbelievable fact of having been spared. And the warships ran, tens of thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands, the great gathered might of the compact, pouring out through the lanes the humans held open, fleeing a fleet that had unmade their masters and let them go. It was the largest rout in the history of the galaxy, and not a single fleeing ship was fired upon, and the keeper understood that this too was on purpose, that the humans wanted them to live, wanted them to carry it home, wanted 400 species to learn from 40,000 fleeing throats what the festival record would have buried. Veth Sarun did not run. The keeper watched the marshal's tower until the end, and the marshal did not flee, because there was nowhere a bloom marshal could flee to where the thing he had grown would not follow him in the memory of every survivor. The tower was the last thing the human fleet unmade. The keeper saw it cease, clean and silent, no fire, no debris, the void smooth where 9,000 years of murder had stood, and he did not feel glad, and he did not feel sorry, and he wrote down only that it was gone, because that was the truth, and the truth was the whole of his work now. The voice read the last name as the tower vanished. Earth, it said, and it did not unmake a ship for that one. There was no cedar left to unmake. They had all gone. So instead, the human voice did the thing it had been building toward for 4 hours, the thing the whole long funeral procession had come out of the void to do, and it read the name of its own dead world into the silence of the broken anchorage with no ship to mark it, because the mark was the silence itself, the absence where 800,000 celebrating ships had been. Earth, the voice said again, quietly, the last name on the list. We let you take it. We have told you why. We needed you all in one place, and you gave us a festival, and you turned your lamps all the way up so we could find you in the dark. A pause. We are not extinct. We were never extinct. We were patient, the way a thing is patient that has decided to outlast its own murder. We let the bloom take the surface of our world while we built these ships under it, in 11 years of dying, and we let you celebrate, because a galaxy that thinks you are dead does not look for you, and a galaxy that does not look for you cannot stop you from coming back for the names. The anchorage was nearly empty now. The barges were gone, spinward and anti-spinward, out into the safe dark. The warships were gone, fled in their hundreds of thousands. There was only the wreck-smooth void, the smooth places where the guilty had been, and the 2 gray walls of the human fleet, lampless, silent, holding the dark. The keeper, alone on his terrace, keyed the band one last time. What do I write? He asked. It was a keeper's question, the only one he had left. 10 million people will go home and tell 10 million stories, and the warships will carry 40,000 more, and they will all be wrong in 40,000 different ways. I am the keeper. I am the record. What do I write so that it is true? The human voice was quiet for a long time. When it answered, it was not the funeral voice, and it was not the person on the bridge. It was something between. Something that the keeper thought might be the closest a human ship ever came to grief. Write that we did not want this, the voice said. Write that we built these ships in the dark, under our own dying world, and we hoped, every day for 11 years, that we would not have to use them, that the compact would stop, that someone in your black tower would look at the readings coming back wrong from Earth, and wonder what it meant, instead of writing stubborn. No one wondered. So write that we came. Write that we read the list. Write that we knew the difference between a cedar and a singer, and that the difference is the only thing that has ever mattered, and that your marshals spent 9,000 years proving they could not see it. A pause. And write that we let the rest of you live, not because you deserved it, because we are the ones who paid to learn what the bloom forgot, and a thing that has paid that price does not get to forget it, just because forgetting would be easier. Write that, keeper. Write that humanity remembered the difference even on the night it had every reason in the galaxy to forget. The keeper wrote it, He wrote every word, and then he asked the last question he had, the question that had been growing in him since the first prow came through the dark. "There is one thing I do not understand," he said. "You waited. 4 centuries you spread quietly at the edge of the dark, and did not bow, and did not join, and did not strike. 11 years you let the bloom crawl across your world. You let your homeworld go gray. You let 10 million people gather to sing about your deaths. You could have struck sooner. You could have struck Earth's attackers in Earth's own sky. Why did you wait until the festival? Why did you wait until everyone was here?" The human voice was quiet for a while. The keeper thought, for a moment, that it would not answer, that this was the one thing the Grey Fleet would carry home unsaid. Then it answered, and the answer was the heaviest thing the keeper put in the record that night. "Because if we had struck Earth's attackers in Earth's sky," the voice said, "we would have killed 400,000 hulls, and the Compact would have called us a new enemy, and grown another fleet, and seeded another world, and in 1,000 years, there would have been a festival for our second death, and nothing would have changed. The bloom would still exist, the marshals would still grow worlds and call them songs, the galaxy would still believe the dark takes everything and sorts nothing." A pause. "So we did not strike Earth's attackers. We waited until the whole order that built the bloom gathered itself in one place to celebrate, and we came there, where everyone could see, where 40,000 crews could carry it home, and we did the one thing the bloom can never do. We sorted. We separated the singers from the seeders in front of the whole galaxy, and we let the singers live, and we ended only the thing that could not tell the difference. We did not wait because we were patient, Keeper. We waited because we wanted witnesses. We waited because a death no one sees changes nothing, and we did not come out here to change one battle. We came out here to change what the galaxy believes about the dark." The keeper set down his stylus. For the first time in 240 years, he could not write, because there were no words yet that were large enough, and he understood that the making of those words was going to be the work of the rest of his life. His stylus moved across the record and put the last words down exactly, and as he wrote, the 2 gray walls began to draw back, sliding toward the wounds in the void they had come through, the funeral procession folding itself back into the dark from which it had come. They left no banners, they left no claim on the anchorage, no garrison, no demand. They had come for the names, and they had read the names, and now they were going home, to a gray world they would have to clean of the bloom by hand, 1 acre at a time, for the rest of their long stubborn lives. The last ship to leave was the grave of the patient, with its 312 names down its flank, and as it reached the wound in the dark, it spoke one final time, not on the wide band now, but on a narrow line, threaded to a single terrace, to a single old keeper, standing alone above an empty harbor. "You asked a keeper's question, Oman Sharel," the voice said. "You were the only one who did. Out of 10 million people, you were the one who keyed the band to see the barges, instead of the warships. We noticed. We notice everything. It is the only thing we have left." A pause. "There will be a record now, a true one, because of you. 400 species are going to argue about this night for 1,000 years, and they are going to be wrong, and your record is going to be the one thing that is right. Keep it well. That is a heavier thing than a fleet. We would know." And then the grave of the patient passed through the wound in the void, and the wound closed behind it, and the dark was only dark again. The keeper stood on his terrace for a long time. He would learn, in the days and years that followed, the full shape of the night he had kept. He would learn that every barge had escaped, all of them, 10 million people carried out through the held open lanes without a single death among the singers and the brewers and the children. He would learn that hundreds of thousands of warships had fled and lived, and that they had carried the night home to 400 species in 40,000 tellings, and that the tellings, wrong as they were, all agreed on the one thing that mattered, which was that the dark had sorted the guilty from the innocent, and spared the innocent on purpose. He would learn that a young marshal named Resh Volun had flown out of the Black Tower in a courier and carried home the first true account of the bloom, and that the account had broken the Yasani High Command from the inside, because there is no defense a marshal can mount against one of his own who has decided to tell the truth. He would learn that the bloom was gone, every garden hull unmade, and that no world would ever again be grown over and called a song, because the thing that grew them was a smooth place in the void now, and the knowledge of how to grow them had died with the men in the Black Tower. And he would learn, last of all, the thing that mattered most to him, the thing he had not dared hope for. He would learn that his record had survived. The marshals were gone, and could not bury it. The festival was over, and could not drown it. The true account, the honest ledger of 312 worlds, with the count of the dead beside each name, the first such ledger that had ever existed in 9,000 years, was in his keeping, and it was his to give to the galaxy, and he gave it. He spent the rest of his long life giving it, traveling from world to world, reading the names aloud the way the Grey Fleet had read them, teaching 400 species the difference between a victory and a murder, between a seeder and a singer, between the dark that takes everything and the dark that sorts. He became, in his last years, the most listened-to keeper the Compact had ever produced, and he never once told the story to make himself larger in it. He always told it the same way. He said he had been the one who was writing it down, and that on the worst night in the history of the galaxy, a thing in the dark had let 10 million people live, and that he had asked it why, and it had told him, and he had written down the answer, and the answer was the whole reason he was still talking. But all of that was still ahead of him, for now, he only stood on his terrace. Below him, the Vale anchorage was empty and silent, the festival lights still burning on nothing, 10 million abandoned cups and banners and unfinished songs drifting in the gold-lit dark. The largest gathering in the history of the galaxy was gone, scattered to the spinward and anti-spinward lanes, fleeing home with a story that no one would believe, and that everyone would have to. The marshals were gone, smooth places in the void. The bloom was gone, every garden hull unmade. The 9,000-year weapon ended in a single night, by a species that had been declared dead at a party. The keeper looked down at his record. It was the truest thing he had ever written, and it had cost him everything he thought he had known, and he found that he was not sorry. He was old. He had kept too many festivals that were lies. He had been given, at the very end of his long life, one festival that was true, and he meant to spend whatever years he had left, making sure it stayed that way, because a thing in the dark had told him the record was heavier than a fleet, and a thing in the dark had been right about everything else. Far away, on a gold barge fleeing anti-spinward through the safe dark, a young brewer named Sef Haloon sat at the helm she had taken and watched 400 children sleep in the hold behind her, alive, every one of them, and she did not yet have the words for what had happened to her, and she would not have them for years. But she knew one thing already, the way the young know things in their bodies before their minds catch up. She knew that she had spent her whole short life being told a story about the dark, about what was out there, and what it wanted, and why her marshals kept her safe from it, and she knew now that the story had been backwards. The thing in the dark had held the door open for her. The thing in the dark had counted 400 children and decided they would live. The thing her marshals had grown over and called a victory had turned out to be the only thing in the whole burning anchorage that knew the difference between her and the men who had murdered 312 worlds. She would tell that story for the rest of her life. She would tell it badly at first, and better as she got older, and she would never quite make anyone believe the part that mattered most, which was not the size of the gray ships or the silence of the bloom, or the names read aloud for 4 hours in the dark. The part that mattered most was that they had not had to spare her, and they had. Behind her, the Vale anchorage fell away into the dark, its festival lights still burning over nothing, the song of the galaxy's greatest victory finally, completely silent. And somewhere out past the Tannin Verge, folding back toward a gray and dying world they would spend their lives healing by hand, 800 gray dreadnoughts carried home a list of 312 names, and the knowledge that they had read it true, and the one heavy, honest thing the galaxy had refused for 9,000 years to learn, until a dead species came out of the void to teach it. The difference between a seeder and a singer. It had always been the only thing that mattered. It had taken the death of a world to remember it, and a keeper on an empty terrace, writing in the dark, made very sure that this time, the galaxy would not be allowed to forget.